Welcome to where time falls quiet.
Earth wasn't ours first, the rulers before the flood. Take a moment to subscribe, so this place of calm is always here for you. What if the first page of history was not the beginning, but the epilogue? What if everything we call civilization, the first cities, the first laws, the first written word, was not invention, but restoration? Hold that thought. Because the evidence waiting in museum archives, carved into weathered stone and pressed into clay tablets thousands of years old, suggests something deeply unsettling. Human history did not begin when we started writing it down. It resumed. The problem starts with a silence, not the comfortable silence of prehistory, where we imagine our ancestors slowly learning to sharpen stones and tame fire. This is a different silence. It is the silence of a gap, a void in the narrative that should not exist. When the first Sumerian cities emerged along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers around 3200 BCE, they did not crawl out of the mud with crude tools and simple shelters. They appeared already built, already literate, already governed by complex legal codes and astronomical calendars that rival our own. There was no apprenticeship period, no archaeological layer showing the slow accumulation of knowledge. One moment, there is nothing. The next, there is Uruk. Imagine standing in the ruins of that first great city now. The ziggurat rises in geometric precision against the desert sky, its mud brick walls still bearing the marks of mathematical planning that would not be matched in Europe for 3,000 years. The streets run in grid patterns. The temple complexes hold thousands of clay tablets, each one documenting trade routes, astronomical observations, and legal contracts written in a fully developed cuneiform script. The language itself is a linguistic isolate. It has no ancestors, no primitive precursors. It simply exists, complete and functional, as if downloaded into history from an unknown source. This is not how civilizations are supposed to form. This is not how knowledge accumulates. And yet, here it is. The archaeologists who first excavated these sites in the late 1800s expected to find layers. They expected to dig down through centuries of gradual development, watching pottery become more refined, tools more sophisticated, writing more complex. They found none of that. Instead, they found what Sir Leonard Woolley would later describe as a civilization that appeared with no childhood. The mathematics was already advanced, base 60 number systems that we still use today to measure time and angles. The astronomy was already precise. They tracked Venus cycles with an accuracy that modern planetariums confirm. The architecture was already monumental. Structures that required organizational capacity, engineering knowledge, and labor coordination on a scale that should have taken millennia to develop. It was all there from the beginning, as if copied from a blueprint no one can find. But here is where the silence begins to hum with implications. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented their civilization. Read their own texts carefully, and you will find something remarkable. They consistently describe their knowledge as inherited. The king lists, the creation myths, the legal codes, all of them reference an earlier time, an older source, a previous authority. The famous Sumerian king list, inscribed on the Weld Blundell prism around 2000 BCE, does not begin with human rulers. It begins with the line, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." The document then lists 8 kings who ruled before a catastrophic flood, each reigning for tens of thousands of years. Modern scholars dismiss this as mythology, as metaphor, as the fanciful exaggeration of a pre-scientific culture. But what if it is not metaphor? What if it is memory? The flood they reference is not fiction. Geological surveys across Mesopotamia reveal a distinct sediment layer dating to approximately 8,800 BCE, a band of water-deposited clay sandwiched between two civilization layers. Beneath this floodline, the archaeological record shows evidence of advanced settlement. Above it, there is a gap, and then the Sumerian cities appear, as if rebuilt by survivors who remembered what had been lost. The correlation between the textual record and the stratigraphic evidence is too precise to ignore. The Sumerians were not inventing a flood myth. They were documenting an event that interrupted their history and forced them to start again, not from scratch, but from fragments of something older. Now extend that thought outward. The flood narrative is not unique to Mesopotamia. It appears in ancient Egypt, where Manetho records a deluge that destroyed earlier dynasties. It appears in India, where the Matsya Purana describes Manu rebuilding civilization after the waters recede. It appears in Mesoamerica, where the Aztec and Maya calendars mark a world-ending cataclysm, followed by a new creation. It appears in Greek legend, where Deucalion survives the flood sent by Zeus. It appears in Polynesian oral traditions, in Chinese flood myths, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and of course, in the Hebrew Bible. These cultures were separated by oceans and millennia, with no contact, no trade routes, no shared language. And yet, they all remember the same thing: a catastrophic inundation that reset the world and erased what came before. The question is not whether the flood happened. The geological and textual evidence is overwhelming. The question is, what was washed away? If the Sumerians, Egyptians, Indians, and every other ancient culture described their knowledge as restoration rather than innovation, then what were they restoring? Who built the original? Who established the laws, the astronomy, the mathematics that these first civilizations claim to have inherited? The answer is not in what they built. It is in what they copied. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza, standing in perfect alignment with true north to within 3/60ths of a single degree. Consider the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device so mechanically sophisticated that its reconstruction required modern clockwork engineering. Consider the Piri Reis map of 1513, which accurately depicts the coastline of Antarctica as it existed before it was covered in ice. A coastline that would not be verified until seismic mapping in 1949. Consider the Nazca lines, geometric patterns carved into the Peruvian desert that are only fully visible from the air. Consider the Cyclopean walls of Sacsayhuaman, where stones weighing over 100 tons are fitted together without mortar. The joints so precise that a sheet of paper cannot slide between them. These are not primitive artifacts. These are the works of a tradition that knew what it was doing. And that tradition, according to every ancient text, did not begin with us. The kings who built the pyramids claimed they were restoring monuments that had existed before their dynasties. The Indian Vedas describe ages of civilization stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. The Mayan long count calendar begins in a year so remote, 3114 BCE, that it predates any known Mayan culture. Everywhere you look, the ancients are pointing backward, insisting that they were not the first, that the knowledge they used came from an earlier source, that the laws they followed were given to them, not invented by them. They are telling us plainly, we are the inheritors. We are the rebuilders. We are the custodians of something older. So here is the uncomfortable truth that emerges from the silence. Human civilization, as we know it, did not originate with humanity. It was transmitted. The first cities were reconstruction projects. The first laws were copies. The first writings were attempts to preserve what had been remembered from before the flood. The evidence does not describe the birth of civilization. It describes its resurrection. And if that is true, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who ruled before the resurrection? Who sat on the throne before the flood? Who established the order that every ancient culture claims to have inherited? The texts are explicit and they are consistent across continents and centuries. The rulers who governed before the deluge were not human. The Sumerian king list calls them the Apkallu, the sages from the abyss. The Egyptian tradition calls them the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. The Hindu Vedas call them the Devas and Asuras, the shining ones and their adversaries. The Hebrew Bible calls them the Nephilim, the giants who walked the earth in those days. The names change, but the pattern does not. Before humanity built its cities, something else was already here. Something that knew mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and law. Something that ruled. And when the flood came, that rule was interrupted, not ended. The throne was left empty. And humanity, emerging from the wreckage, found the blueprints and tried to rebuild. The silence before recorded history is not the silence of absence. It is the silence of erasure. Something was here. It built. It ruled. It left traces in every monument, every tablet, every flood myth that refuses to stay buried. And the deeper we dig, the louder that silence becomes. Because if the first civilizations were restorations, if the knowledge was inherited, if the laws were given rather than invented, then everything we think we know about human origins is not the beginning of the story. It is the middle, and the beginning belongs to someone else. The city of Uruk rises from the desert floor in broken geometric shapes, its walls still visible beneath the sand after 5,000 years. When archaeologists first excavated this site in the late 1800s, they expected to find what they had found everywhere else: layers of human progress, stacked like pages in a book, each one showing gradual improvement over the one beneath it. Crude pottery giving way to refined ceramics, simple tools evolving into complex instruments, basic pictographs developing slowly into written language. That is how civilizations are supposed to form. That is the pattern that Darwin's theory had taught the world to expect. Slow, incremental, evolutionary advancement. But Uruk did not follow the pattern. Uruk violated it completely. The deepest excavation layer at Uruk, dated to approximately 3,400 BCE, reveals a city that was already operating at full capacity. The architecture was not primitive. The structures were monumental, temples with foundations that required surveying knowledge, load-bearing calculations, and organizational systems capable of coordinating thousands of workers over years of construction. The pottery was not crude experimentation. It was mass-produced on wheels, standardized in size and shape, fired in kilns that required temperature control and fuel management. The agriculture was not subsistence farming. It was industrial-scale irrigation with canal systems extending for miles, gates and locks regulating water flow, and granaries storing surplus that fed a non-farming urban population. This was not a village learning to become a city. This was a city that appeared already knowing how to function. But the true anomaly was not the buildings or the irrigation. It was the tablets. In the temple complexes and administrative buildings of Uruk, archaeologists found thousands of clay tablets covered in cuneiform script. The earliest tablets from the very first occupation layer are not primitive scribbles or experimental marks. They are sophisticated administrative documents recording complex transactions, legal contracts, astronomical observations, and mathematical calculations. The cuneiform system they use is fully developed. It has phonetic signs, logograms, determinatives, and grammatical markers that indicate a mature writing system, not an infant one. There is no archaeological layer beneath this showing the gradual invention of writing. The script simply appears, complete and functional, as if the Sumerians sat down one day and began writing in a language they already knew how to use. This is what makes academia uncomfortable. The expectation was clear. Writing should emerge slowly, beginning with simple pictographs that gradually become abstract symbols, then phonetic markers, then full grammatical structures. It should take centuries, maybe millennia, of trial and error. But Sumerian cuneiform skips the apprenticeship. The earliest tablets show a writing system that is already capable of expressing abstract legal concepts, recording multivariable mathematical problems, and documenting astronomical cycles that require years of continuous observation. It is as if the Sumerians did not invent writing. They remembered it. Consider tablet CBS 10673, currently housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. It is a small clay square no larger than a smartphone, inscribed around 2000 BCE. The text is a list of 21 different professions, each with a corresponding symbol and phonetic spelling. There are farmers, merchants, scribes, priests, judges, astronomers, engineers, metalworkers, and temple administrators. This is not a society in its infancy. This is a society with a fully stratified economy, a division of labor so complex that it required specialized training and institutional memory to maintain. The tablet does not describe the beginning of these professions. It assumes they already exist. It is an inventory, not an origin story. Now move forward in time, not backward. Examine tablet Plimpton 322, dated to approximately 1800 BCE, currently held at Columbia University. This tablet contains a list of 15 number pairs arranged in columns. For over a century, mathematicians debated its purpose. Then, in the 1940s, they realized what they were looking at: Pythagorean triples. These are sets of three numbers that satisfy the equation where the square of the longest side of a right triangle equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides. The theorem that bears Pythagoras' name would not be formally articulated in Greece until 500 BCE, more than 1,000 years after this tablet was made. And yet, here it is, not as a theorem to be proven, but as a reference table to be used. The Sumerians were not discovering this mathematics. They were applying it. The numbers on Plimpton 322 are not simple. They involve calculations with 5-digit integers, reciprocal pairs, and trigonometric ratios. The precision required to generate these numbers without modern calculators or algebraic notation suggests a level of mathematical literacy that rivals modern engineering programs. The mathematician who inscribed this tablet knew what he was doing. He understood the relationships between numbers, the properties of right triangles, and the practical applications of these ratios in architecture and astronomy. This was not a primitive culture slowly learning to count. This was a culture that had inherited a complete mathematical system and was teaching it in scribal schools. And the base 60 number system they used, the same system we still use to measure time in hours, minutes, and seconds and angles in degrees, did not emerge from counting on fingers and toes. It is a system optimized for astronomical calculation because 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes complex fractions manageable without decimals. It is an engineer's number system designed for precision work, not a shepherd's counting method. The Sumerians did not stumble into base 60 through trial and error. They adopted it because it was the most efficient system for the kind of advanced calculations they needed to perform. And they needed to perform those calculations from the very beginning. The astronomical tablets are even more revealing. Tablet mul.apin, a compendium of Babylonian astronomy compiled around 1000 BCE, but based on much older Sumerian observations, lists the rising and setting times of 33 constellations, the paths of the planets, the dates of solstices and equinoxes, and the length of daylight throughout the year. The observations are accurate, the cycles are correct, the predictions are reliable. This is not folklore. This is data compiled over centuries of systematic observation recorded by scribes who understood what they were watching and why it mattered. The tablet does not explain how to begin observing the sky. It assumes the reader already understands the principles of celestial mechanics. It is a reference manual, not a textbook. The legal codes present the same paradox. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dated to approximately 2100 BCE, is the oldest known legal text. It is not a primitive list of prohibitions. It is a sophisticated legal framework with conditional clauses, proportional punishments, and distinctions between intentional and accidental harm. It addresses property rights, inheritance law, marriage contracts, and commercial disputes. It assumes the existence of courts, judges, witnesses, and a literate bureaucracy capable of enforcing complex rulings. This is not the first attempt at law. This is a refined system that has already been tested and adjusted. The code itself states that it is restoring justice that had been disrupted, not inventing justice for the first time. And here is the critical detail that historians consistently overlook. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented any of this. Read the inscriptions carefully. King Shulgi of Ur, writing around 2000 BCE, boasts that he is a scribe trained in the ancient schools, that he has mastered the knowledge passed down from before the flood, that he is restoring the wisdom of the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity after the deluge. He does not claim to be an innovator. He claims to be a custodian. The entire Sumerian worldview is based on preservation, not progress. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a tradition that was already ancient when they received it. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian texts, describes how the god Enki warned the king Ziusudra of an impending flood and instructed him to build a vessel to preserve the seed of humanity and the knowledge of civilization. After the waters receded, Ziusudra is granted immortality and tasked with teaching the survivors what had been known before. The text does not describe Ziusudra inventing agriculture or writing or law. It describes him restoring them. The flood is the dividing line. Before it, there was an older civilization. After it, there was Sumer trying to rebuild. The archaeological record supports this narrative. Beneath the flood layer in Mesopotamian excavations, there is evidence of settlement. Not primitive camps, but organized communities with rectangular buildings, pottery kilns, and evidence of grain storage. The Ubaid culture, which predates Sumer by over 1,000 years, already shows signs of complex society. And beneath that, there are traces of even earlier occupation. The timeline keeps extending backward, and each new layer reveals not increasing primitiveness, but increasing sophistication that suddenly stops at the flood boundary and then resumes afterward with a different cultural signature but similar technological capacity. It is as if the knowledge survived the disaster, but the people who originally developed it did not. So when we look at Sumerian civilization and see a culture that appeared fully formed, with no learning curve, no primitive stage, no gradual accumulation of knowledge, we are not looking at a miracle. We are looking at restoration, the cities, the writing, the mathematics, the astronomy, the law. These were not inventions. They were reconstructions based on inherited blueprints. The Sumerians were not the first civilization. They were the first post-Diluvian civilization, and everything they built was an attempt to recover what had been lost when the waters came and washed the old world away. The Great Sphinx of Giza sits in silence, facing east toward the rising sun, its limestone body carved from the bedrock of the Giza Plateau. According to the standard archaeological timeline, it was built during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, around 2500 BCE, part of the 4th dynasty's monumental building program. The evidence for this attribution is thin, a single fragmentary inscription and the monument's proximity to Khafre's pyramid. But the stones themselves tell a different story. The Sphinx bears scars that should not exist, erosion patterns that contradict every assumption about when it was made and what kind of climate it has endured. The scars are not from wind or sand. They are from water, heavy, sustained, torrential water. The kind of water that has not fallen on the Giza Plateau for 11,000 years. In 1990, geologist Robert Schoch stood at the base of the Sphinx enclosure and examined the weathering patterns carved into its limestone walls. What he found was unambiguous. The vertical erosion channels running down the surface of the enclosure were not the result of wind abrasion or sand scouring, the typical weathering processes in a desert environment. They were the result of precipitation, sustained rainfall that had pooled and flowed down the stone face, cutting deep fissures into the rock over centuries of exposure. Schoch compared these patterns to other limestone structures on the plateau. The temples and tombs definitively dated to the 4th dynasty showed horizontal weathering, the signature of wind-driven sand. The Sphinx showed vertical weathering, the signature of water. The geological evidence was clear. The Sphinx had been exposed to a climate regime fundamentally different from the arid conditions that have prevailed in Egypt for the past 5,000 years. The climate data supports this conclusion. The Sahara was not always a desert. Between 15,000 and 5,000 BCE, North Africa experienced what geologists call the African humid period, a climatic phase when the region received monsoon rains capable of sustaining lakes, rivers, and vegetation across what is now barren sand. The most intense precipitation occurred between 10,000 and 8,000 BCE, when annual rainfall in the Sahara was 4 to 6 times higher than today. This was the window when water, serious, erosive, channel-carving water, fell on the Giza Plateau. And the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure match this window perfectly. If the Sphinx was carved during Khafre's reign in 2500 BCE, it would have experienced only 500 years of the humid period's tail end before the climate shifted to desert conditions. That is not enough time to produce the depth and severity of water erosion visible on the monument. But if the Sphinx was carved earlier, during the peak of the rainfall, the erosion makes sense. The implications of this are staggering. If the Sphinx predates Khafre by thousands of years, then it was not built by the 4th dynasty Egyptians. It was inherited by them. The archaeological establishment resists this conclusion with remarkable intensity, insisting that no civilization capable of carving a monument of this scale existed before the rise of dynastic Egypt. But the stones do not lie. Limestone records water. The vertical channels, the undulating surface, the depth of the weathering, these are not interpretations. They are measurements. And the measurements say the Sphinx is older than the civilization that claims to have built it. Now examine the enclosure itself. The Sphinx was not carved from transported blocks like the pyramids. It was carved in situ, meaning the massive trench surrounding it was excavated directly from the bedrock. The limestone blocks removed from this trench were used to build the adjacent Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple, structures whose architectural style and massive megalithic core blocks suggest a construction date far earlier than the 4th dynasty. The core blocks of these temples weigh up to 200 tons each, fitted together without mortar, their surfaces showing the same water erosion as the Sphinx enclosure. The 4th dynasty Egyptians were master builders, but their construction technique involved smaller, more manageable stones. The megalithic style seen in the Sphinx temples is characteristic of much older construction traditions found in Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, and other pre-dynastic sites. It is as if the Sphinx complex was built in phases, the original monument and core temples carved and constructed during a much earlier period, then restored and expanded by later Egyptian dynasties, who found it already ancient. The Egyptian historical record hints at this. The inventory. Stela, discovered near the Great Pyramid in the 1850s and currently housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, contains an inscription attributed to Pharaoh Khufu, the supposed builder of the Great Pyramid. The text describes how Khufu ordered restoration work on the Sphinx after it was damaged by lightning. It refers to the Sphinx as already existing during Khufu's reign, already ancient, already requiring repair. Mainstream Egyptology dismisses the stela as a later forgery, arguing that its linguistic style dates to the 26th dynasty, around 600 BCE. But even if the inscription is a copy, it preserves a tradition that predates the 4th dynasty claim. The Egyptians themselves did not believe they built the Sphinx. They believed they found it. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, does not mention the Sphinx at all in his extensive description of the Giza Plateau. This is remarkable. Herodotus documented the pyramids in detail, interviewing Egyptian priests and recording local traditions. If the Sphinx was visible and associated with the pyramid builders, he would have mentioned it. The most likely explanation is that the Sphinx was already buried in sand during his visit, its body concealed beneath the dunes, forgotten even by the Egyptians who lived beside it. The monument had to be excavated multiple times throughout history, by Thutmose IV in 1400 BCE, by the Romans in the 1st century CE, and finally by modern archaeologists in the 1920s. Each time it was uncovered, it was already ancient. Each time it was buried again by the desert, waiting for the next generation to rediscover it and ask the same question. Who built this, and when? But here is the detail that makes the orthodox timeline untenable. The erosion inside the Sphinx enclosure is more severe than the erosion on the Sphinx body itself. If both were carved at the same time and exposed to the same weathering conditions, the erosion should be uniform. It is not. The enclosure walls show deep, pronounced vertical channels. The Sphinx body shows weathering, but less severe, more consistent with the protected position of its lower sections and the restoration work that has been repeatedly applied to its surface over millennia. This differential erosion suggests a sequence. The enclosure was excavated first, exposed to the heavy rains of the African humid period, and deeply weathered. The Sphinx was carved from the remaining bedrock later, but still within the window of significant rainfall, and then partially buried by sand for long periods, protecting it from further erosion. The monument we see today is not a single construction event. It is the survivor of multiple phases, the last remnant of a project that began when the climate was wet and the Giza Plateau was green. The astronomical alignment offers another clue. The Sphinx faces due east, aligned with the equinox sunrise. But if you project the view backward in time using precession calculations, the Sphinx would have faced the constellation Leo during the vernal equinox, around 10,500 BCE. This is not proof, but it is suggestive. The symbolism is consistent, a lion-bodied monument facing its celestial counterpart during the Age of Leo, a time when the Sahara was wet and human cultures were transitioning from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural communities. If the Sphinx was designed as a marker, a time capsule, or a monument to astronomical knowledge, its orientation and form encode the era of its creation. And that era is not the 4th dynasty. It is the 10th millennium BCE. The resistance to this dating is not scientific, it is institutional. Accepting that the Sphinx is older than dynastic Egypt requires accepting that a civilization capable of large-scale stone carving, astronomical observation, and monumental planning existed before the first pharaohs. It requires rewriting the timeline of human development. It forces the question, if they could build the Sphinx, what else did they build that we have attributed to later cultures? The flood myths, the irrigation systems, the astronomical alignments, the mathematical tablets. All of it suddenly looks like restoration rather than invention. The Sphinx becomes the geological proof of what the texts have been saying all along. There was something before, and it was washed away. Stones, remember. Limestone, when exposed to water, chemically reacts, softens, and erodes in predictable ways. The process is measurable, the timeline is calculable, and the Sphinx, standing silent in the desert, still carries the memory of rain. Rain that fell when the world was different. Rain that carved channels into stone while something older than Egypt watched the sunrise. The question is no longer whether the Sphinx is older than we have been told. The question is, who carved it when the rain was falling? And what happened to them when the rain stopped? Imagine holding a small clay tablet in your hand, no larger than a paperback book, its surface covered in columns of numbers pressed into the clay 4,000 years ago. The tablet is catalogue number Plimpton 322, currently housed at Columbia University, and it is one of the most disturbing artifacts in the archaeological record. Not because of what it depicts, but because of what it knows. The numbers inscribed on this tablet represent Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 integers that satisfy the relationship where the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other 2 sides of a right triangle. This mathematical relationship would not be formally articulated as a theorem until Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE. More than 1,000 years after this tablet was made. And yet, here it is. Not as a discovery to be celebrated, but as a reference table to be consulted. The Babylonians who used this tablet did not think they were doing advanced mathematics. They thought they were doing basic arithmetic. And that tells you everything. The numbers on Plimpton 322 are not simple. The tablet lists 15 rows of number pairs, each representing the short side and the hypotenuse of a right triangle. But these are not small, easy integers. Some of the numbers exceed 12,000. Calculating these values without modern algebraic notation or electronic calculators requires understanding reciprocal relationships, square root approximations, and the properties of similar triangles. The scribe who created this tablet had to know not just that these relationships existed, but how to generate them systematically. This was not trial and error. This was algorithmic thinking. The tablet is not a proof or a derivation. It is a computational tool, the mathematical equivalent of a slide rule. It assumes the user already understands the principles and simply needs the numbers. But here is what makes this tablet genuinely unsettling. There is no earlier version. There is no archaeological layer showing the gradual development of this mathematics. There is no prototype tablet with simpler examples or practice problems. Plimpton 322 appears in the record fully formed, part of a mathematical tradition that was already mature when the first cuneiform tablets were being pressed. The Old Babylonian period from which this tablet dates is around 1800 BCE. By that time, Mesopotamian scribal schools were teaching mathematics as a standard part of the curriculum, using problem sets and reference tables that presuppose years of prior instruction. The textbooks exist, the teaching methods exist, but the origin does not. The mathematics appears as if downloaded complete into Sumerian culture, with no apprenticeship, no fumbling early attempts, no mistakes that were later corrected. Now consider the base 60 number system that underpins all Mesopotamian mathematics. We still use this system today to measure time and angles: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. But we inherited it. We did not invent it, and neither, it seems, did the Sumerians. The base 60 system is not intuitive. Most early cultures counted in base 10 using their fingers, or base 20 using fingers and toes. Base 60 is different. It is a mathematically optimized system, chosen because 60 has 12 divisors, making it exceptionally useful for fractional calculations. You can divide 60 by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30 without generating remaining fractions. This makes complex astronomical calculations manageable without decimal notation. It is an engineer's choice, not a shepherd's counting method. The question is, who made that choice? The earliest Sumerian tablets from 3200 BCE already use base 60 for administrative and astronomical calculations. There is no transition period from base 10 to base 60. There is no evidence of experimentation with other systems. The base 60 framework appears complete and is used consistently across all mathematical contexts from the beginning. This suggests that the system was not invented by the Sumerians. It was adopted by them, inherited from a prior mathematical tradition that had already recognized the computational advantages of sexagesimal notation. The Sumerians were not mathematicians experimenting with number systems. They were scribes copying a system that someone else had perfected. Tablet YBC 7289, housed at Yale University, contains a geometric problem involving the diagonal of a square. The problem asks, if the side of a square is 30, what is the length of the diagonal? The answer, given on the tablet, is 42 and 25 sixtieths, plus 35 36 hundredths. In modern decimal notation, that is approximately 42.426. The actual value of 30 times the square root of 2 is 42.4264. The Babylonian approximation is accurate to 5 decimal places. This level of precision requires not just understanding the concept of irrational numbers, but having methods to approximate them systematically. The tablet shows the calculation, but it does not explain the method. It assumes the scribe already knows how to extract square roots to arbitrary precision. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. Tablet BM 13901 in the British Museum contains a problem that asks the student to calculate the area of a circle given its circumference. The method used employs a value for pi of 3 1/8, which equals 3.125. The actual value of pi is 3.14159. The Babylonian approximation is within 1% accuracy. For comparison, the ancient Egyptians used a value of approximately 3.16, and the biblical approximation in the Book of Kings is exactly 3. The Babylonians were closer. They were closer because they had better methods, more refined techniques, and access to a computational tradition that had spent generations refining these constants. You do not arrive at 3 1/8 for pi by accident. You arrive at it through systematic measurement, geometric analysis, and iterative refinement over time. The question is, whose time? The tablets appear already knowing this value with no record of the process that generated it. The astronomical calculations are even more telling. Tablet MUL Apin, the Babylonian Astronomical Compendium, lists the synodic periods of the planets, the time it takes for each planet to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun. The values given for Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are accurate to within a few days over multi-year observation cycles. Calculating these periods requires continuous observation over decades, precise timekeeping, and the mathematical tools to process irregular orbital data into predictable cycles. The Babylonians had all of this, but they could not have developed it in a single generation, or even a single century. Astronomical knowledge accumulates slowly, observation by observation, correction by correction, over lifetimes of dedicated watching. And yet, the earliest Mesopotamian astronomical records show this knowledge already in place, already accurate, already being taught as established fact, rather than being discovered as new data. The trigonometric functions embedded in Tablet Plimpton 322 become even more remarkable when examined closely. Modern mathematicians analyzing the tablet realize that the number pairs are not random Pythagorean triples. They are systematically generated to cover a range of angles, specifically angles whose tangent values form a regular sequence. This means the tablet was not just a list of right triangles, it was a trigonometric table, a reference for calculating angles and ratios needed for surveying, construction, and astronomical prediction. The concept of trigonometry as a formal discipline would not emerge in Greece until Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE. But the Babylonians were using trigonometric methods 1,500 years earlier, not as theory, but as applied engineering. They did not name the sine or cosine. They simply calculated the ratios they needed and used them. Now stack all of this evidence together. Advanced algebra appearing with no precursors, a base 60 system optimized for computation adopted without transition, Pythagorean geometry predating Pythagoras by over a millennium, accurate approximations of irrational constants like square root of 2 and pi, trigonometric tables embedded in tablets that predate formal trigonometry, and astronomical precision requiring generations of observation, but appearing in the earliest records. The pattern is unmistakable. Mesopotamian mathematics was not invented. It was restored. The tablets are not textbooks written to explain new discoveries. They are reference manuals written to preserve old knowledge. Every problem set, every calculation, every astronomical table points backward, not forward. The Babylonians were not pioneers. They were custodians. And the Babylonians knew this. Read the colophons at the end of mathematical tablets, the small inscriptions that identify the scribe and the source. They frequently state that the text is copied from older tablets, that the knowledge comes from before the flood, that the methods were taught by the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought wisdom to humanity after the deluge. The scribes did not claim authorship. They claimed transmission. Their role was not to create, but to accurately copy what had been handed down, to ensure that the mathematics survived even if the original teachers did not. The clay tablets we hold now are not the beginning of mathematics. They are the emergency backup, the knowledge preserved by a culture that knew it was inheriting something precious and fragile, something that had been lost once and could be lost again. The void from which this mathematics emerged was not empty, it was flooded, and when the waters receded, the survivors wrote down everything they could remember, pressed it into clay, and fired it so that it would last. The tablets are not the origin of the knowledge, they are its echo. There is a layer of sediment buried beneath the cities of ancient Mesopotamia that tells a story academia refuses to hear. It is not metaphor, it is not mythology translated into geology, it is stratification. A distinct band of water-deposited clay, sterile and culturally empty, sandwiched between two layers of human occupation. The layer is consistent across multiple excavation sites separated by hundreds of miles: Uruk, Shuruppak, Kish, and Nineveh. It appears at roughly the same depth, dated to approximately 8,800 BCE, and it marks a boundary. Below the flood layer there is evidence of settlement, pottery, tools, and organized agriculture. Above the flood layer, after a gap in the archaeological record, civilization resumes, but it resumes differently. The cultural signature changes. The pottery styles shift. The architectural techniques evolve. It is as if the flood did not just interrupt human occupation, it erased the continuity of cultural transmission and forced the survivors to rebuild from memory. Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating the Royal Cemetery at Ur in the 1920s, was the first to document this flood layer in detail. He dug down through the graves, through the temple foundations, through the residential districts, and then he hit clay. Not the clay of construction debris or gradual silt accumulation, but a clean, uniform deposit of water-laid sediment 3 meters thick in some locations. Beneath this clay layer, he found more artifacts, more pottery, more evidence of human habitation. The stratigraphy was clear. People lived here, then water covered everything. Then people returned. Woolley believed he had found evidence of the biblical flood, the deluge described in Genesis. He was not entirely wrong, but the flood was older and more widespread than the biblical timeline suggests. It was not a localized Mesopotamian river overflow. It was a catastrophic inundation event that left geological markers across multiple continents and cultural memories in every ancient civilization that survived it. The flood narratives are not isolated to the Middle East. They appear in Sumerian texts like the Eridu Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim survives the deluge by building a boat and preserving the seed of all living things. They appear in the Hebrew Bible, where Noah follows identical instructions and the waters cover the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. They appear in the Hindu Matsya Purana, where Manu is warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu and builds a vessel to survive the flood. They appear in Greek mythology, where Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha are the sole survivors of a flood sent by Zeus to cleanse the earth of human corruption. They appear in Chinese tradition, where the Emperor Gun and his son Yu battle a great deluge that threatens to destroy civilization. They appear in Mesoamerican codices, where the Aztec creation myth describes the world being destroyed by water in the age of the fourth sun. These are not independent inventions. The details are too consistent. The structure is too similar. A divine warning, a chosen survivor. A vessel constructed to specific dimensions. The preservation of animals and seeds. The landing on a mountain after the waters recede. The re-establishment of civilization by the survivors. The rainbow or celestial sign that promises no repetition. These narrative elements repeat across cultures that had no contact with each other No trade routes, no shared language, no mechanism for cultural transmission. The only explanation that accounts for this consistency is a shared experience. Something happened that was so catastrophic, so universally traumatic, that every human population that survived it encoded the memory into their foundational myths and passed it down through generations of oral and written tradition. The geological evidence confirms what the myths describe. Marine fossils have been found at high elevations across the Himalayas, the Andes, and the Rocky Mountains, indicating that these regions were once submerged or experienced massive flooding. Sediment cores taken from the Black Sea reveal evidence of a catastrophic flooding event around 7,600 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus and flooded the freshwater lake that occupied the basin, raising water levels by hundreds of feet and drowning coastal settlements in a matter of days. Similar flooding events have been documented in the Persian Gulf, where sea level rise at the end of the last ice age submerged fertile river valleys and forced populations to migrate inland. The timeline of these events clusters around the end of the Younger Dryas period, between 13,000 and 8,000 BCE, a time of rapid climate change, glacial melting, and catastrophic sea level rise. But the flood was not just rising sea levels. It was something more sudden, more violent, more geographically widespread. Geologists studying sediment layers in North America have identified evidence of massive flooding in the Columbia River Basin, where glacial Lake Missoula burst through its ice dam repeatedly between 15,000 and 13,000 BCE, releasing water volumes equivalent to the flow of all the rivers on Earth combined. The floods carved the channeled scablands in Washington state, a landscape of deep canyons, dry waterfalls, and massive boulder fields that could only have been created by water moving at catastrophic velocities. Similar megaflood features have been identified in Siberia, where glacial lakes dammed by ice sheets released enormous volumes of water as the ice retreated, carving valleys and depositing sediment across thousands of square miles. The Younger Dryas itself presents a mystery that the flood myths might explain. The period began abruptly around 12,800 BCE, when global temperatures dropped dramatically, glaciers re-advanced, and the steady warming trend that had been melting the Ice Age glaciers suddenly reversed. The cause is debated, but the leading hypothesis involves a massive influx of fresh water from melting ice sheets, disrupting ocean currents, particularly the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation that regulates climate in the Northern Hemisphere. If a glacial dam failed catastrophically, releasing billions of tons of ice-cold fresh water into the North Atlantic, it could have shut down the Gulf Stream, plunging Europe and North America back into glacial conditions. The flood would have been both the trigger and the consequence of this climate shift, the mechanism that initiated the Younger Dryas cold snap. The impact hypothesis adds another dimension to this scenario. Evidence of cosmic airburst events around 12,800 BCE has been found in the form of microscopic diamonds, magnetic spherules, and carbon-rich layers consistent with extraterrestrial impacts or atmospheric explosions. If a comet or asteroid fragment struck the ice sheets covering North America, the energy release would have been sufficient to melt massive volumes of ice instantaneously, generating the megafloods documented in the geological record and triggering the climate disruption that characterized the Younger Dryas. The ancient texts describe celestial fire falling from the sky immediately before the flood, a detail that aligns disturbingly well with the impact hypothesis. The Book of Enoch describes stars falling to earth. The Popol Vuh describes fire raining from above. The Mahabharata describes weapons that generated heat like 1,000 suns. If these are not metaphors, if they are attempts to describe something witnessed, then the flood was not just water. It was fire first, then water. The synchronized collapse of late Pleistocene megafauna supports a catastrophic event. Between 13,000 and 10,000 BCE, dozens of large mammal species went extinct across the Americas, Europe, and Asia. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, cave bears, and woolly rhinoceroses all disappeared within a narrow window of time. The prevailing explanation is human overhunting combined with climate change, but the timeline is suspiciously compressed. Extinctions that should have been spread over thousands of years occurred within centuries. Frozen mammoths have been found in Siberia with undigested food still in their stomachs, suggesting death by sudden freezing rather than gradual starvation. The evidence points to a rapid, traumatic environmental shift that these species could not survive. The flood myths describe exactly this: a world-ending catastrophe that killed most living things and forced the survivors to adapt or perish. The human population bottleneck visible in genetic data aligns with this timeframe. Studies of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages indicate that modern human populations descend from a relatively small number of ancestors who lived between 15,000 and 10,000 BCE. The genetic diversity we see today suggests that human populations crashed dramatically during this period and then rebounded from a limited founder population. This is the genetic signature of a near-extinction event, a demographic collapse that would be expected if a catastrophic flood wiped out coastal settlements, fertile river valleys, and low-elevation population centers where the majority of humans lived. The survivors would have been those at higher elevations, inland populations, and those fortunate enough to be warned or positioned to escape. The Sumerian king list divides history into two epochs: before the flood and after the flood. The antediluvian kings are described as ruling for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years, which scholars interpret as mythological exaggeration. But if these numbers encode astronomical cycles or represent dynastic rather than individual reigns, they might preserve real chronological information about a civilization that existed for millennia before the flood destroyed it. The post-Diluvian kings have normal human lifespans consistent with historical rulers we can verify. The flood is the boundary. Everything before it is described as older, greater, more advanced. Everything after it is reconstruction. The text does not describe the flood as divine punishment for human sin. It describes it as a natural disaster that the gods themselves feared and barely survived. The flood was not intentional. It was catastrophic, even for those who supposedly controlled it. The archaeological sites that predate 8000 BCE show evidence of sudden abandonment. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, was deliberately buried, its massive stone pillars covered with soil as if to protect or preserve them. Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest urban settlements, shows signs of rapid depopulation around 7500 BCE. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities, has a gap in its occupation layers corresponding to the flood period. These sites were not gradually abandoned due to resource depletion or migration. They were left suddenly, as if the populations had no time to take their possessions or dismantle their structures. Something forced them to leave in haste, and many never returned. The Great Pyramid of Giza sits on the Giza Plateau at coordinates 29.9792 degrees north latitude. This number is not arbitrary. When expressed in meters per second, the speed of light in a vacuum is 299,792,458. The pyramid's latitude encodes the speed of light to 4 decimal places. This is not approximation. This is not coincidence. This is encoded information placed with precision that should not be possible for a Bronze Age civilization that did not possess telescopes, did not understand light as electromagnetic radiation, and had no theoretical framework for measuring the velocity of photons through space. And yet, there it is, carved into the bedrock of the plateau. A line to true north within 3/60ths of a single degree, positioned at the exact coordinates that express one of the fundamental constants of the universe. The question is not how they did it. The question is, what else did they encode that we have not yet recognized? The dimensions of the pyramid contain the ratio of Earth's circumference. The perimeter of the base, when measured at the level of the original casing stones, totals 1,760 cubits. When you multiply this number by 43,200, you get the polar circumference of Earth in meters to within 0.05% accuracy. The height of the pyramid, originally 146.6 meters, when multiplied by 43,200, gives the polar radius of Earth. The ratio between height and base perimeter is identical to the ratio between Earth's radius and its circumference. This is not architectural flourish, this is cartographic encoding. The pyramid is a scale model of the Northern Hemisphere built at a ratio of 1 to 43,200. The builders were not constructing a tomb. They were constructing a monument that encoded planetary dimensions with precision that would not be matched until satellite geodesy in the 20th century. The internal passages are aligned to specific stars with precessional accuracy. The so-called King's Chamber contains a shaft that points to Orion's belt, specifically the star Alnitak, at its position during the epoch of 10,500 BCE. The Queen's Chamber shaft points to Sirius at the same epoch. These alignments are not random. They are calculated to account for the 26,000-year precessional cycle, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis that changes the position of stars in the sky over millennia. To design a structure that encodes stellar positions from 8,000 years before its supposed construction date requires understanding precession, calculating its rate, and projecting star positions backward through time. This is not Bronze Age astronomy. This is astrophysics. The builders knew the stars were not fixed. They knew the sky was changing, and they built a monument that would preserve the stellar configuration of a specific epoch, as if marking a moment in time that mattered. The construction precision of the pyramid violates every assumption about ancient building capability. The granite blocks in the King's Chamber are fitted so precisely that the gaps between them measure less than half a millimeter. These are not small stones. They weigh up to 70 tons each and were transported from quarries 500 miles away in Aswan. Modern engineers using laser-guided cutting tools and hydraulic lifts struggle to achieve tolerances this tight. The ancient Egyptians supposedly accomplished this with copper chisels, wooden sledges, and rope. The standard explanation requires believing that workers using primitive tools could cut, transport, lift, and position multi-ton granite blocks to tolerances that modern construction rarely achieves. The alternative is that the tools they used were not primitive. The techniques they employed were not experimental. The knowledge they possessed was not developing. It was inherited. The acoustic properties of the King's Chamber reveal another layer of sophistication. When tested with resonance frequency analysis, the chamber produces a fundamental frequency of 110 Hz, a tone that corresponds to the note A in modern musical tuning, but 3 octaves lower. This frequency is not accidental. The dimensions of the chamber are precisely calculated to generate this resonance, and the granite blocks amplify rather than dampen the vibration. Research into acoustic archaeology has shown that 110 Hz is a frequency that affects human consciousness, altering brainwave patterns and inducing states of heightened awareness or meditative focus. Ancient cultures across the world built resonant chambers in temples and sacred sites, from Newgrange in Ireland to the Hypogeum in Malta, all tuned to similar frequencies. The Great Pyramid is not just encoding mathematical constants, it is encoding vibrational frequencies that interact with human neurology in measurable ways. The casing stones that originally covered the pyramid were polished white limestone, cut and fitted so perfectly that observers described the surface as a single, continuous mirror. The reflective quality was so intense that the pyramid could be seen from the mountains of Israel, glowing in the sunlight like a beacon. But these stones were not decorative. They were functional. The limestone casing created a smooth, angled surface that would have dramatically affected the acoustic properties of the structure, potentially acting as a resonator that amplified sound or focused energy in ways we are only beginning to understand. The casing stones were systematically removed in later centuries to build mosques and fortifications in Cairo, but historical accounts and fragments that remain confirm their existence and precision. The pyramid was designed to be seen, to be heard, and possibly to be activated. The ratio between the pyramid's height and its base perimeter is pi divided by 2, a relationship that naturally emerges from the geometry of a circle but should not appear in a structure built with right angles and flat surfaces. The ancient Egyptians supposedly did not have a formal understanding of pi as an irrational constant, and yet the pyramid's proportions encode it. The perimeter of the base equals the circumference of a circle whose radius is the height of the pyramid. This is not an accident of design. It is an intentional encoding of circular geometry within rectilinear architecture. The pyramid is simultaneously a square and a circle, a geometric impossibility made physical through mathematical precision that transforms abstract relationships into massive stone. The alignment to the cardinal directions is disturbing in its accuracy. True north is not magnetic north. Magnetic north wanders, shifting position over time due to fluctuations in Earth's magnetic field. True north is the direction along the planet's rotational axis, a purely geometric concept that requires astronomical observation to determine. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north within 0.058 degrees of arc. This is tighter than most modern buildings. To achieve this alignment, the builders had to observe the stars, track their movements across the sky, calculate the center point of their rotation, and transpose that observation into architectural orientation. This requires tools we have no evidence they possessed: precision measuring instruments, stable observational platforms, and mathematical frameworks for converting angular measurements into ground-level alignments. Every explanation offered involves techniques that leave no archaeological trace, tools that have never been found, and knowledge that appears nowhere in the Egyptian historical record. The volume of the pyramid, when calculated using the original height and base dimensions, equals approximately 2.58 million cubic meters. When divided by 100, this number approximates the total land area of the Nile Delta in square kilometers. The pyramid is encoding geographical data, not just about its own location, but about the region it overlooks. This suggests that the builders possessed surveying capabilities far beyond what we attribute to them: the ability to measure large-scale geographical features and encode those measurements into architectural proportions. The pyramid is not just a building, it is a database, a three-dimensional archive of mathematical, astronomical, geographical, and possibly acoustic information preserved in the most durable material available. The question becomes unavoidable. Where did this knowledge come from? The 4th dynasty Egyptians, according to conventional chronology, were emerging from the late pre-dynastic period, a time of relatively simple villages and basic agriculture. Within a few generations, they supposedly developed the engineering knowledge to build the most precisely constructed building on Earth. Encoding mathematical constants they had no framework to understand, aligning to celestial positions requiring decades of observation, and achieving construction tolerances that modern technology struggles to match. There is no learning curve. There is no prototype period with failures and refinements. The pyramids at Giza represent the peak of pyramid construction, not the beginning. And that peak appears at the start of the Old Kingdom, as if the knowledge was already complete when construction began. The Egyptian texts offer a different explanation. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in human history, inscribed on the walls of 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids, do not describe the pyramids as tombs. They describe them as resurrection machines, devices designed to transform the pharaoh into a star, to elevate consciousness, to enable the deceased to navigate the underworld and achieve immortality. The texts are not symbolic poetry. They are instruction manuals, step-by-step guides that assume the reader understands the function of the chambers, the significance of the alignments, and the purpose of the acoustic resonance. The Egyptians did not build the pyramids to glorify their kings. They built them to preserve and transmit technology that they inherited from an earlier time, technology whose full purpose they no longer completely understood, but knew was too important to lose. The Weld Blundell prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a clay cylinder no larger than a wine bottle, inscribed with columns of cuneiform text pressed into its surface around 2000 BCE. The document it contains is known as the Sumerian King List, a chronological record of every ruler who held sovereignty in ancient Mesopotamia, from the beginning of kingship until the period of its composition. The text is clinical, almost bureaucratic, written in the same accounting style used for grain inventories and temple records. It lists names, cities of reign, and lengths of rule with the precision of a ledger. But the numbers it records are impossible. The first 8 kings, those who ruled before the Great Flood, are credited with reigns totaling 241,200 years. Modern scholars dismiss these figures as mythological exaggeration, symbolic rather than literal, the imaginative invention of a culture that did not yet understand historical time. But what if the numbers are not symbolic? What if they are encoded? The text begins with a statement that is matter-of-fact in its enormity. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The first king, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. The second king, Alaljar, ruled for 36,000 years. The third king, Enmenluana, ruled for 43,200 years. These numbers are not random. They are multiples of 3,600, a number called a sar in Sumerian mathematics, representing one complete cycle of the zodiac as measured by precessional motion. The 3,600-year cycle is not arbitrary. It represents the time required for the precessional movement of the equinoxes to shift through 50 degrees of arc, 1/7 of the complete precessional cycle of 25,920 years. The Sumerians were not inflating the ages of mythical kings. They were recording astronomical time, measuring reigns not in human lifetimes but in celestial cycles. The total duration of antediluvian kingship, 241,200 years, can be divided by 3,600 exactly 67 times. This is not coincidence. The number 67 appears nowhere else in Sumerian numerology with particular significance, but it emerges here as a natural product of the base 60 system applied to astronomical observation. If the king list is encoding precessional cycles, then the antediluvian period represents 67 complete Sar cycles, a span of time that would have been measurable only through continuous observation of stellar positions and their gradual drift across the sky. The ancient Mesopotamians had this capacity. Their astronomical texts prove they tracked Venus cycles, lunar nodes, and planetary conjunctions with accuracy that required generational observation. Tracking precession requires the same methodology applied over even longer timescales. The king list might be preserving data from an observational tradition that spans not centuries, but tens of millennia. Consider the reign of Enmenluana, 43,200 years. This number is exactly 12 Sar cycles of 3,600 years each. It is also the time required for the precessional movement to complete 1/6 of its total cycle, moving through 60 degrees of the zodiac. If we interpret this not as a single king's lifespan, but as a dynastic period or a recorded epoch of astronomical observation, the number becomes meaningful. It represents the time during which a particular constellation occupied the vernal equinox position, the marker of the zodiacal age. The age of Leo, the age of Cancer, the age of Gemini. Each of these astrological ages lasts approximately 2,160 years. A period of 43,200 years encompasses 20 such ages, or 2 complete passes through the zodiac from the perspective of precessional observation. The Sumerian king list is not recording fantasy, it is recording astronomy. The 8th and final antediluvian king, Ziusudra, is the Sumerian equivalent of Noah. He is the flood hero, the one who builds the boat and survives the deluge. His reign is listed as 36,000 years, exactly 10 Sar cycles. The Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian flood narrative, describes how Ziusudra is warned by the god Enki that a catastrophic flood is coming, and that he must preserve the seed of humanity and the knowledge of civilization. The text does not describe Ziusudra inventing agriculture, writing, or mathematics after the flood. It describes him teaching what had been known before, transmitting the wisdom that the antediluvian civilization had accumulated. The king list supports this narrative structure. The flood is the boundary. Everything before it is measured in cosmic time. Everything after it is measured in human time. After the flood, the king list states, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when the kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The post-diluvian kings have normal reigns. Gar-Ur of Kish ruled for 1,200 years. His son, Gulanidaba Anapad, ruled for 960 years. These numbers are still exaggerated by modern standards, but they are no longer astronomical. They are within the realm of legendary longevity, comparable to the patriarchs in Genesis who lived for centuries rather than millennia. The scale has changed. The system of measurement has shifted. The antediluvian numbers recorded cosmic cycles. The post-diluvian numbers record dynastic tradition, possibly encoding family lineages or cultural periods rather than individual lifespans. But the transition is marked clearly. The flood separates 2 different methods of timekeeping, 2 different civilizations, 2 different relationships with astronomical knowledge. The parallel with Genesis is too precise to ignore. The Bible lists 10 patriarchs from Adam to Noah, and the Sumerian king list lists 8 kings, from Alulim to Ziusudra. Both traditions place a catastrophic flood at the boundary between primordial time and historical time. Both traditions describe the post-Diluvian world as a restoration of what existed before, guided by survivors who carried the memory of the old world into the new. The Genesis account preserves the same pattern. Noah's descendants are credited with founding the first cities, inventing agriculture, and establishing the arts of metalworking and music. They do not discover these things. They remember them. The biblical narrative and the Sumerian narrative are parallel memories of the same event, preserved through different cultural transmissions, but encoding identical information about a lost civilization and its catastrophic end. The number 3600 appears elsewhere in ancient tradition, with specific astronomical meaning. The ancient Indian yugas, the vast epochs of cosmic time described in Hindu cosmology, are calculated in multiples of 3600 years. The Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness and decline, is said to last 432,000 years, exactly 120 Sar cycles. The Greeks recorded a similar tradition through Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in the 3rd century BCE that the antediluvian period lasted 432,000 years, governed by 10 kings. This is the same number, the same structure, the same astronomical encoding. The tradition is consistent across Mesopotamia, India, and the Hellenistic world. The antediluvian period was not a myth. It was a chronological system based on observable celestial mechanics, preserved through the flood as a memory that multiple post-diluvian cultures attempted to decode and transmit. The Egyptian tradition preserves a similar pattern through Manetho, the Egyptian priest and historian who compiled the king lists of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE. Manetho records dynasties of gods and demigods who ruled Egypt before the first human pharaohs, with reigns lasting thousands of years. Modern Egyptology dismisses this as mythology, but the structure parallels the Sumerian king list precisely. There is a primordial period governed by non-human or semi-divine rulers, measured in astronomical time. Then there is a catastrophe, described in Egyptian tradition as a great flood or fire. Then there is a restoration period where human dynasties emerge, claiming legitimacy by tracing their authority back to the gods who ruled before. The Egyptian king lists are not independent inventions. They are cultural variants of the same historical memory, the same attempt to preserve a chronology that extends far beyond the conventionally accepted timeline of human civilization. The king list's astronomical encoding becomes even more precise when examined through precessional mathematics. The rate of precession is approximately 1 degree every 72 years, a number that appears repeatedly in ancient mythology and architectural alignments. The Great Pyramid's internal passages change angle by 1 degree every 72 years when adjusted for precession. The Norse mythology records 72 gods who fight at Ragnarok. The Hindu tradition describes 72,000 nadis, the energy channels in the human body, mirroring the cosmic structure. The number 72 is the key to unlocking the king list's code. When you multiply 72 by 3600, you get 259,200, the approximate length of one complete precessional cycle. The antediluvian period of 241,200 years represents approximately 93% of a full cycle, a span of time that would encompass the observable drift of all constellations across the ecliptic. The Sumerian king list is not recording rains. It is recording the motion of the sky. Every ancient lawgiver claimed the same thing. The laws they established were not their invention. They were received. Hammurabi, standing before the Assembly of Babylon around 1750 BCE, inscribed his famous law code on a black basalt stele that still exists in the Louvre Museum. At the top of the stele, carved in relief, the king stands before the seated god, Shamash, who extends his hand toward Hammurabi in a gesture of transmission. The inscription states clearly that Hammurabi did not write these laws. He received them from the divine, from a source that predated his reign and possessed authority greater than his own. The laws were not created to govern Babylon. They were restored to govern Babylon, brought back into effect after a period of chaos or disruption. This is not the language of innovation. This is the language of preservation. The Code of Hammurabi contains 282 laws covering commercial transactions, property rights, family law, and criminal justice. The sophistication of these statutes is extraordinary. They distinguish between intentional and accidental harm, establish proportional punishment based on social class, create legal protections for widows and orphans, regulate medical malpractice, and define inheritance rights with precision that rivals modern civil codes. These are not the first experimental attempts at justice. These are refined legal principles that have been tested, adjusted, and codified over generations of application. The code assumes the existence of courts, trained judges, literate scribes, and a bureaucracy capable of enforcing complex rulings across a large urban population. This infrastructure does not emerge overnight. It requires institutional memory, educational systems, and social consensus built over centuries. Yet Hammurabi presents it as received knowledge, handed down from the divine authority of Shamash, the sun god who sees all and judges fairly. Move westward to Mount Sinai, and the pattern repeats. Moses, leading the Israelites out of Egypt around 1300 BCE, according to traditional chronology, ascends the mountain and returns with tablets of stone inscribed with divine law. The Ten Commandments are not presented as Moses's moral philosophy or the consensus of tribal elders. They are presented as the direct words of Yahweh, the supreme deity who created the cosmos and establishes its order. The commandments cover fundamental social prohibitions: murder, theft, adultery, false testimony, but they also establish ritual obligations, dietary restrictions, and governance structures for the emerging Israelite nation. The legal framework that follows in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy is comprehensive, addressing everything from property disputes to hygiene practices to the conduct of warfare. Moses does not claim authorship. He claims transmission. The law existed before he received it. His role was to deliver it to a people who had forgotten or never known it. The structure of Mosaic law parallels Hammurabi's code with disturbing precision. Both legal systems establish lex talionis, the principle of proportional justice expressed as an eye for an eye. Both systems create distinctions between free citizens and slaves, with different penalties for the same crime, depending on the victim's status. Both systems regulate commercial lending, setting limits on interest rates and establishing debt forgiveness cycles. Both systems include extensive purity codes governing food, cleanliness, and ritual behavior. The similarities are too specific to be independent invention. Either the Israelites borrowed from Babylonian legal tradition during their exile, or both legal systems derive from a common earlier source that predates both cultures. The biblical narrative supports the latter interpretation. The law given to Moses is described as eternal, existing before creation, the cosmic order that governs not just human society, but the structure of reality itself. Cross the Indus River into the Indian subcontinent, and the pattern appears again. The laws of Manu, compiled sometime between 200 BCE and 200 CE, but claiming origins in the far more ancient Vedic period, present a comprehensive legal and social code attributed to Manu, the progenitor of humanity and the first king after the Great Flood. Manu did not create these laws through philosophical reflection or political negotiation. He received them from Brahma, the creator deity, who instructed him on how to rebuild civilization after the waters receded and the world was cleansed. The Manusmriti covers criminal law, civil procedure, property rights, caste obligations, dietary restrictions and governance structures with a level of detail that assumes centuries of development. Yet, it is presented as received wisdom handed down from the divine architect of the cosmos to the first human survivor of the deluge. The legal content of the Manusmriti shares structural similarities with both Hammurabi and Moses. It establishes proportional justice, distinguishes between intentional and accidental harm, creates different legal standards for different social classes, regulates commerce and property, and embeds religious obligation within civil law. The caste system it describes is presented not as a human invention, but as the cosmic order, the natural hierarchy that reflects the structure of the universe itself. This is not social engineering. This is cosmological mapping. The laws are not tools for organizing society. They are reflections of an eternal order that exists independent of human will, and the lawgiver's role is to recognize and articulate what already exists rather than create something new. Move eastward to China, and the pattern persists. The legendary emperor Yu the Great, founder of the Xia dynasty around 2100 BCE, is credited with establishing the first comprehensive legal code in Chinese tradition. But Yu did not invent these laws through personal wisdom. He received them from the divine through the study of the Yellow River chart and the Luo River diagram, mystical patterns that revealed the mathematical and moral order of the universe. The laws Yu established covered taxation, land distribution, irrigation management, and criminal justice, creating the administrative framework that would define Chinese governance for millennia. Yet Chinese tradition does not present Yu as an innovator. It presents him as a restorer, the emperor who rebuilt civilization after the Great Flood that had destroyed the world of his predecessors. The parallels extend beyond legal content to the mythological framework surrounding the lawgivers. Hammurabi, Moses, Manu, and Yu all operate in the shadow of a catastrophic flood that destroyed the previous world order. All of them are rebuilders, tasked with restoring civilization rather than creating it for the first time. All of them receive their authority and their legal codes from divine sources that predate human history. All of them emphasize that the laws they transmit are not inventions, but recoveries, attempts to restore the order that existed before the deluge washed it away. The consistency across Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Indian, and Chinese traditions is remarkable. These cultures had no direct contact during the periods when these legal traditions were being formalized. They were separated by thousands of miles, different languages, incompatible writing systems, and centuries of historical development. Yet they all tell the same story. Law was given, not made. The concept of natural law that emerges in Greek and Roman philosophy echoes this same pattern. Plato describes the ideal forms as eternal, unchanging templates that exist in a realm beyond human access. And the just society is one that aligns its laws with these transcendent forms. Aristotle argues that justice is not conventional, but natural, that the principles of right action are embedded in the structure of reality and can be discovered through reason. The Stoics developed this into a comprehensive philosophy of natural law, arguing that the cosmos is governed by logos, rational order, and that human law should conform to this cosmic rationality. Roman legal theorists like Cicero articulate natural law as ius gentium, the law of nations, a universal legal framework that transcends local custom and reflects the fundamental principles that govern all human societies. These are not theories of legal innovation. These are theories of legal discovery, the recognition that law exists prior to and independent of human legislation. The medieval Christian tradition synthesizes these concepts through Thomas Aquinas, who distinguishes between eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. Eternal law is the cosmic order established by God at creation. Natural law is the portion of eternal law accessible to human reason. Human law is the practical application of natural law to specific circumstances. Divine law is the supernatural revelation of God's will through Scripture. In this framework, legitimate human law is never invention. It is always recognition and application of a pre-existing order. The lawgiver's task is not to create justice, but to align human society with the justice that already exists in the structure of the universe. This is the same claim that Hammurabi, Moses, and Manu made 3,000 years earlier. The law comes from above. It is received, not written. Now stack all of this evidence and ask the uncomfortable question: if every ancient legal tradition claims that law was transmitted rather than invented, received from divine or cosmic sources rather than created through human deliberation, what does that tell us about the origin of civilization itself? The consistency is too precise to dismiss as coincidence or independent cultural development. The structural similarities are too specific to explain through universal human psychology. These legal codes share specific provisions, specific punishments, specific frameworks for property rights and family law that go beyond basic moral intuitions about murder and theft. They reflect a common template, a shared blueprint that predates the individual cultures that claim it. And if that template was not created by any of these cultures, then it must have come from somewhere else, from something earlier, from the civilization that ruled before the flood. The evidence no longer permits comfortable assumptions. When you place the Sumerian tablets beside the Egyptian monuments, when you stack the flood myths against the geological sediment layers, when you compare the mathematical precision of Plimpton 322 with the astronomical alignments of the Great Pyramid, when you read the consistent testimony of every ancient lawgiver that their codes were received rather than invented, a single conclusion becomes unavoidable. Human civilization as we know it was not the beginning. It was the resumption. The first cities were not experiments in urban living. They were reconstruction projects. The first laws were not innovations in social order. They were copied templates. The first writings were not the invention of literacy. They were the preservation of memory. Everything we call the dawn of civilization is actually the twilight of something older, the desperate attempt of survivors to rebuild what the flood had washed away. Consider the totality of the pattern. Every major ancient culture describes its foundational knowledge as inherited from an earlier time. The Sumerians credit the Apkallu, the 7 sages who emerged from the sea after the deluge and taught humanity the arts of civilization. The Egyptians reference the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus who ruled before the dynasties and established the original order. The Indians describe the Saptarishi, the 7 sages who preserved the Vedas through the destruction and transmitted them to the post-Diluvian world. The Chinese tradition speaks of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, semi-divine rulers who governed before recorded history and established the foundations of Chinese culture. The Mesoamerican cultures describe Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, culture heroes who arrived after a great catastrophe and taught agriculture, astronomy, and law. These are not independent mythological inventions. These are parallel memories of the same event, preserved through different cultural lenses but encoding identical information. The archaeological timeline supports this narrative. The earliest Sumerian cities appear around 3200 BCE with full literacy, complex mathematics, and monumental architecture already in place. There is no gradual development visible in the archaeological record. There is no layer showing primitive pictographs evolving into cuneiform, no evidence of simple mud huts gradually becoming sophisticated temples, no progression from basic counting to advanced algebra. The sophistication appears at the beginning, as if the knowledge already existed and simply needed to be applied. The same pattern appears in Egypt, where the first dynasty emerges around 3100 BCE with hieroglyphic writing, advanced astronomy, and engineering capabilities that rival any later period. The Old Kingdom represents the peak of pyramid construction, not its developmental phase. The greatest precision, the most sophisticated design, the most accurate astronomical alignment. All of this appears at the start and gradually declines in later dynasties. This is the opposite of what evolutionary models predict. If civilization were developing naturally through trial and error, we would expect to see increasing sophistication over time. Early attempts would be crude, later efforts refined. The pyramids should get better, not worse. The mathematics should become more advanced, not simply maintained. The astronomical observations should grow more precise as instruments improve and knowledge accumulates. But that is not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows peak capability at the beginning, followed by gradual decline, periodic revival, and ultimate loss. The Fourth Dynasty builds the Great Pyramid with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The Fifth Dynasty builds smaller pyramids with cruder construction and less precise alignment. By the Middle Kingdom, pyramid building has declined to the point where most structures collapse within centuries. By the New Kingdom, the pharaohs have abandoned pyramids entirely and build tombs in hidden valleys. This is not progress. This is decay. The same pattern appears in writing systems. The earliest cuneiform tablets show a fully developed script with grammatical markers, phonetic signs, and abstract conceptual vocabulary. Later tablets maintain this system but do not significantly improve it. The script becomes more standardized, more widely used, but not more sophisticated. Hieroglyphic writing in Egypt follows the same trajectory. The earliest examples from the First Dynasty already demonstrate the complex combination of logograms, phonetic signs, and determinatives that will characterize the script for 3,000 years. Later developments simplify and democratize writing through hieratic and demotic scripts, but these are adaptations for practical use, not advances in expressive capability. The peak of sophistication is at the origin, not at the culmination. The astronomical knowledge preserved in ancient texts reflects the same pattern. The Babylonian astronomical diaries that survive from the 7th century BCE contain observations and predictions of planetary positions, lunar eclipses, and stellar occultations with remarkable accuracy. But these diaries are not presenting new discoveries. They are consulting tables and methods that the texts explicitly state were handed down from earlier times. The Mul Apin tablets compile astronomical knowledge from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, but those texts reference even older sources. The tradition extends backward, each generation acknowledging that it is preserving rather than creating, copying rather than innovating, maintaining rather than advancing. The role of the astronomer priest was not to discover new celestial phenomena, but to accurately record what previous generations had already observed and ensure the knowledge was not lost. The flood serves as the inflection point in every tradition. Before the deluge, there was an older civilization that possessed advanced knowledge, built great structures, and established the laws and customs that would govern humanity. During the flood, that civilization was destroyed, its cities submerged, its populations decimated, its knowledge scattered. After the flood, survivors who remembered fragments of what had been lost worked to restore civilization, rebuilding cities on older foundations, copying texts from damaged originals, teaching what could be remembered of the mathematics and astronomy and law that had existed before. The Sumerian king list marks the boundary explicitly. The antediluvian kings ruled for cosmic time periods measured in Sar cycles. The post-diluvian kings ruled for human lifespans, measured in years and decades. The flood is the break, the discontinuity, the point where the original civilization ended and the restoration began. The genetic evidence supports a population bottleneck during this period. Modern human populations show reduced genetic diversity consistent with a severe reduction in population size between 15,000 and 10,000 BCE. The mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome lineages that characterize contemporary humanity trace back to a relatively small founder population that lived during or immediately after the Younger Dryas cold period. This is the genetic signature of a near-extinction event, the kind of catastrophic loss that would occur if rising seas, megafloods, and climate collapse wiped out coastal settlements and river valley populations where the majority of humans lived. The survivors would have been inland populations, highland communities, and those fortunate enough to have warning or means of escape. These survivors would have carried fragments of the knowledge from the destroyed civilization and worked to preserve and transmit what they remembered. The monumental architecture that predates the conventional timeline provides physical evidence of this lost civilization. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BCE, features massive T-shaped pillars carved with sophisticated bas-reliefs depicting animals, humans, and abstract symbols. The site required organizational capacity, engineering knowledge, and artistic skill that should not exist in a Neolithic hunter-gatherer culture. Yet there it is, older than Sumerian cities, older than Egyptian dynasties, already demonstrating the capabilities that civilizations supposedly took millennia to develop. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, its pillars covered with soil as if to preserve them for future discovery. Who buries a temple complex rather than simply abandoning it? People who know something is coming, who want to protect what they have built, who hope that future generations will uncover and understand what they have preserved. The submerged cities found off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean provide additional evidence. Structures discovered underwater near Dwarka in India show stone construction and urban planning, consistent with advanced civilization, but dated to periods when conventional history places only primitive settlements in the region. The Yonaguni monument off Japan displays carved angles, terraced platforms, and geometric patterns that are difficult to explain as natural formations but predate the accepted timeline of Japanese civilization. These are not anomalies. These are data points that the standard model cannot accommodate. Evidence of coastal civilizations that existed before sea level rise submerged them during the meltwater pulses of the late Pleistocene. The conclusion is inescapable. Civilization did not begin with Sumer. Civilization resumed with Sumer. The cities, the writing, the mathematics, the astronomy, the law, all of it was restoration, not invention. The Sumerians were not pioneers discovering new territory. They were refugees rebuilding from blueprints they had inherited, trying to recover what had been lost. working to preserve knowledge that was already ancient when they received it. Every text that says the wisdom came from before the flood is telling the truth. Every monument that encodes astronomical data from epochs thousands of years before its construction date is preserving real information. Every legal code that claims divine transmission is acknowledging a source older than the culture that copied it. We are not the first civilization. We are the second, and everything we have built stands on foundations we did not lay. Long before the names of Sumer, Egypt, or Babylon were spoken, before the flood swept away the first cities, the throne of the world was already occupied. Every ancient text whispers this, but none of them say it aloud. The Sumerians call them the Apkallu, the sages from the abyss who brought order after destruction. The Egyptians call them the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus who ruled in the era of the gods. The Hindus call them the Devas and Asuras, radiant beings who fought over dominion of heaven and earth. The Greeks called them the Titans. The Book of Enoch calls them the Watchers, the Nephilim, beings who walked the earth in those days when the world was still young. They were not human. They ruled before us, and the civilizations that rose after the flood were not original creations, but echoes of their vanished empire. Imagine standing among the ruins of a civilization so ancient that time itself has conspired to erase its traces. The precision of its geometry, the scale of its architecture, the depth of its astronomical knowledge. Every fragment that has survived hints at minds, not limited by human lifespans or by the learning curve of biological evolution. These rulers were not experimenting, they were maintaining. They had already mastered the alignment of stars, the carving of granite, the manipulation of sound, the coding of mathematical constants into physical form. What came after them were merely reconstructions, human attempts to rebuild from memory the architecture of the gods. The Sumerian king list preserves this memory explicitly. Before the flood, kingship descended from heaven, not metaphorically, but literally. The concept of kingship itself, the divine right to rule, the very structure of civilization, is described as descending from a higher realm. It is not invented from the ground up by humans trying to organize society. It is a gift, or perhaps a command, from beings whose sovereignty predates humanity. The list presents these reigns in astronomical numbers because they measure time differently. 1,000 years to them might be a single cycle, a moment in cosmic chronology. When the flood extinguished their civilization, the lineage of those kings ended, but their influence did not. The survivors of the flood rebuilt in their image, copying the symbols of power, the architecture of authority, the celestial alignments that represented divine order. We see their reflection in every ancient tradition. The Egyptian pharaohs ruled as incarnations of Horus, the living embodiment of divine kingship inherited from the gods who ruled before them. The Mesopotamian kings called themselves shepherds of the gods, not masters. The Indus Valley seals depict figures in meditative poses surrounded by animals, suggesting a memory of rulers who communicated not through law or conquest, but through an understanding of natural forces. The Chinese emperors traced their ancestry to the sons of heaven, claiming the mandate of heaven as inheritance. Everywhere we look, the earliest rulers are not innovators, they are continuations. Their power is derivative, their titles inherited, their symbols borrowed from something that ruled before humanity was ready to understand it. If we strip away the theological language and read these accounts as historical documents, we find a startling coherence. The Apkallu, the Shemsu Hor, the Devas, all share common attributes. They are described as taller than men, luminous, long-lived, and possessing knowledge that reshapes itself. They are often associated with water, the abyss, the sea, the flood, symbols of both life and destruction. They teach humanity agriculture, writing, mathematics, metallurgy, astronomy. When humanity misuses this knowledge, they withdraw or are destroyed. The flood becomes not only a geological event but a moral punctuation, an end to an age in which divine beings walked among humans. What follows is a period of amnesia, a time when humanity remembers the knowledge but forgets its context, rebuilding fragments into religions, myths, and sciences that no longer recognize their common origin. The architecture left behind still bears their fingerprint. The megalithic constructions at Giza, Baalbek, Machu Picchu, and Tiwanaku share a level of precision and technique that defies the capabilities of the human cultures that supposedly built them. The stones are cut with laser-like precision, fitted together with seams so tight that air cannot pass between them, positioned with alignments that match astronomical events long predating their official construction dates. These sites are not the work of isolated human cultures inventing engineering from scratch. They are the remnants of a single architectural tradition, a style beyond time, replicated imperfectly by those who found the ruins still standing after the flood. Even the genetic record contains ghost signatures. There are anomalies in human DNA, segments that appear to have entered the genome tens of thousands of years ago from unknown sources. Some researchers call them ghost populations, extinct lineages that interbred with early humans but left no clear fossils, only fragments of their code hidden in our cells. Others interpret them as evidence of ancient genetic manipulation, the deliberate alteration of early humans by beings with knowledge of life's structure. If this hypothesis sounds impossibly speculative, consider what the myths themselves say. The gods create mankind in their image. They fashion humans from clay, mix their blood with earth, and breathe life into the form. Across cultures, the act of creation is described as a technical process, an act of engineering rather than spontaneous divine magic. If the gods were real, if they were biological entities operating at a higher level of technology, then humanity is not their invention. We are their project. The psychological residue of this inheritance remains embedded in civilization's structures. Every authority system, from monarchy to democracy, still imitates divine kingship. Every temple, courthouse, and government building still follows the architectural geometry of sacred proportions. Even our modern technologies echo the same paradigm: control over the natural environment, mastery of matter through abstract knowledge, moral confusion born from the misuse of power. The story of human civilization is a recursive loop of imitation. We are repeating, not creating, building versions of systems older than recorded time, unable to escape the templates written into our collective memory. When we send spacecraft into orbit or entangle quantum particles, we are rediscovering pieces of a puzzle that was once complete. There is a reason the ancients feared the return of the gods. The texts that describe the flood often end with a warning. The old rulers were not entirely destroyed. They retreated. The Book of Enoch describes the watchers being bound beneath mountains but destined to return when the stars realign. The Mayan calendar marks cycles of destruction and renewal, world ages that begin and end with celestial conjunctions. The Vedic texts speak of yugas, cosmic periods that end with the reappearance of forgotten beings and the restoration of cosmic balance through fire and flood. The Egyptian priests told Solon that their records spoke of multiple destructions, each time humanity rising only to fall again, each time the gods observing from afar. These stories may not be prophecy in a religious sense. They may be records of cyclical cataclysms, events so regular in cosmic time that the ancients encoded them as myth because they lacked the scientific language to describe orbital mechanics, precessional shifts, or cosmic impacts. Ask yourself this: if the flood was the restart and we are the restoration, what happens when the cycle turns again? The geological record shows that cataclysms are not once-in-a-lifetime events. They are rhythmic. Impact cycles, magnetic pole reversals, solar outbursts, tectonic upticks. All of them operate on clocks longer than human history. The pattern of destruction and rebirth is built into the planet's operating system. The ancients knew this because they saw it happen. Their myths preserve what their cities could not. They tried to warn their descendants by encoding knowledge into stone, aligning monuments to star positions that would signal the next great change. We are approaching one now. The same astronomical configurations that mark the end of the last age are drifting into alignment again. The silence between cycles hums once more. So what, then, of the throne before humanity? It was not abandoned, it was entrusted. The laws, the mathematics, the architecture, the encoded constants, these are the inheritance left behind by our predecessors, the archive of a civilization that did not die, but went underground, beneath memory, waiting for conditions to return that would allow it to rise again. The throne is symbolic, yes, but it is also literal, the mantle of guardianship over knowledge and creation. Humanity sits upon that throne now, but we rest uneasily. We have inherited powers we do not understand, tools we use without wisdom, secrets we rediscover without grasping their origins. The old kings may be gone, but their patterns run through everything we build, every system we design, every hierarchy we create. The question that remains, the one the ancients left for us to confront, is not whether they ruled before us. It is whether we are worthy of ruling after them. If civilization is cyclical, if knowledge is a torch passed through floods and fires, then we are only the latest custodians, not the final ones. Our monuments will crumble, our digital archives will drown, our languages will dissolve back into archetype and legend. But somewhere, encoded in stone or in DNA or in the geometry of the stars, the memory will wait to be found again. The same whisper will begin anew. After the flood, kingship will again descend from heaven, and it will not matter whether we call them gods or ancestors or something else entirely. The throne before humanity will never remain empty for long. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos.